Thanks very much for allowing me to be part of this conference. I've really enjoyed meeting quite a few very interesting people and listening to all of these talks. So my name's Natasha Pauli. I am a geographer, so I'm from the University of Western Australia. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is to return to some of the things that Kate was mentioning in her talk. This is a review paper of what has been written and published about farmer knowledge of soil biodiversity, and it's something that I'm working on with Professor Lynette Abbott, who I'm sure many of you will know quite well. As part of our review, I'd like to illustrate some of the really interesting knowledge gaps with a couple of case studies. So there are some important people to acknowledge who have been involved in those two case studies, one in Honduras and one in the Western Australian wheat belt. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Edmundo Barrios, who's here somewhere, and Thomas Oberthur for getting me interested in this topic in the first place. So what is important about local knowledge? Why is this relevant to what we're all here to discuss? I don't think I need to convince anyone of the utility or relevance of the scientific way of understanding the world, but what I would like to emphasise is that scientific research is not the only way that people gain a deep and meaningful understanding of the natural environment. There's a very rich body of knowledge which we'll call local knowledge as a general term, including Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, farmer knowledge and so on, which goes back tens, hundreds, even tens of thousands of years, based on what people have learnt through living on the land in all that time. Raymond et al. Have put together a really nice critical typology of the different kinds of environmental knowledge, which you can have a look at if you're interested in this. But suffice to say, local knowledge is often very deep, it is place-based, it is culturally relevant, and it can provide some really interesting information about environmental patterns and understanding. One of the reasons that people are quite interested in local knowledge is to do with this whole idea of integrated knowledges or hybrid knowledge. So the idea that you can take the best of both worlds. You can take that deep, local and culturally specific understanding of local knowledge and integrate that or combine that with broader understandings from scientific perspectives, and that in an ideal situation can help people to increase resilience, cope with rapid environmental change and so on. But the key point I'd like to make here is that local knowledge in this context, in terms of forming important and effective hybrid knowledge, is just as important as the scientific component. I just very briefly wanted to also go over a fairly common conceptual model for understanding local ecological knowledge, or ethno-ecological knowledge. And this is the knowledge, practice, belief complex. Again, there's a couple of references if you'd like to know this in more detail. This is much simplified. But there are three important domains to think about if you're interested in local knowledge, and they're all interlinked and they're all interrelated. On one hand, you have the body of knowledge held by people, observations of climate, soils, plants, vegetation and so on, built up over many years. A second important part of that triad of different domains is practice. So in this situation, people use their observations, their knowledge and so on to form systems of agriculture, natural resource extraction and exploitation. And a third component, which is also very important to this whole comprehensive nature of ethno-ecological knowledge, is belief. So when elements of the natural world are so important, they become culturally embedded as part of rituals, myths, sacred spaces, even taboos and so on. So again, the main thing to note from all of this is all of these three components are really important in terms of local knowledge. They're interlinked and it's very difficult to separate them out. So why have a study looking at local knowledge of soil biota? And again, I've put the context there that hybrid knowledge is potentially one way of taking advantage of different elements of local and scientific knowledge to increase resilience. But there's a lot of research that has been done in this space. In these 4 boxes, I've put areas where a lot of existing research has been done: ethnopedology, local soil taxonomies, ethnoecology, the volumes that have been written about participatory research and soil and agricultural extension are enormous. What I was really interested in is what do we know about the intersection of these domains? What has actually been published and written about local knowledge of soil biota? And of course, this is only a fraction of what is actually known about local knowledge of soil biota, just what's written. So I'll give you a bit of a preview. We don't know very much, but what has been documented is really fascinating. So to go about defining our review, the first step, of course, was searching for literature. The criteria that we were looking for, it had to be something that was peer-reviewed in a journal or in an edited book. It had to include reference to local farmer or Indigenous knowledge, and primarily the search started with soil macrofauna because that's one of my personal interests, but we've since tried to expand it to mesofauna, fungi, and things that you can't see, of course, as well. Some of the challenges associated with this, we have discovered a number of papers, not a huge number, so 41. I did see Pablo's talk was 8,000 and something, so it's a manageable number. But only a very few of those had a very deep focus on some aspect of soil biota. In the other 60% of studies, soil biota were mentioned, but in passing or as a relatively minor element of the manuscript. There is a lot of information in grey literature, and I've already had the pleasure of speaking to a number of you who've given me various different stories, anecdotes, and leads to reports and so on. So there's a lot of information that hasn't been published. It would be remiss of me to not discuss some of the things that weren't included, such as edible insects, ritual eating of soil, geophagy, decomposition and organic matter as processes were not included. And of course, being from Australia, it would be remiss of me not to discuss the very important role that some edible insects can play in cultures such as the honey ant here is very important to Aboriginal people from the Central Desert region of Australia. Nutritionally important and also enters into cultural aspects as well. So, what did we find? Okay, so it is my fondest hope that this map is very incomplete, okay? What we found so far is 41 papers that fit our criteria and 2 multi-country reviews which haven't been mapped because they cross a number of countries. The geographical focus so far, there's been more work done on this in East Africa, Central Africa as well, Latin America, some parts you can't see it very well, but there are actually a number of studies in the Southeast Asian region also. And given that we are now geographically located in France, the one glaring omission from this map is I could not find anything from Europe. I tried really hard. The closest I found was a conference proceeding which was talking about local knowledge of grassland invertebrates in Hungary, I believe. So if anyone would like to add their information to this map, I would love to talk to you. There are a few hotspots of research that have been done. Honduras and Kenya stand out as countries where multiple studies have been done, and in some ways this probably reflects areas where soil macrofauna research has been done. Of course, you've got the GSBI Institute and a number of countries that were part of the BGBD research initiative are also represented there. Does this concentration of studies reflect the distribution of knowledge about soil fauna? I don't think so. I think it's more reflective of where the question has been asked. Does it reflect the importance of macrofauna in agriculture? Well, it's possible. Many of these systems are low input agricultural systems, but with so few data points, it's really difficult to tell that. And again, if you think your research should be on this map, I would love to hear from you, so please contact me. So in terms of the taxonomic groups that were addressed by these different studies, I've gone through and categorised a number of different elements of the papers in the study. Typically, the papers covered between 1 and 6 broad taxa. Earthworms and termites were the ones that were most commonly addressed. Some of the papers developed a very detailed folk taxonomy of everything that local farmers knew about every insect and every invertebrate ever, but the more common one was 1 to 6 focal taxa, and generally multiple taxa rather than single taxons. What I think was really interesting in terms of who actually defined the different elements of the biota that were included in the study, in around about 3/4 of the studies in our sample, there was some element of either participatory research, so joint definition of the different elements of macrofauna that were important, or farmers actually defined that themselves. So this is really important for participatory research in terms of being involved directly. Some of the themes that have been addressed in these papers, now what I've done here is actually ordered these in decreasing order of the number of papers that had a very specific or detailed focus on soil biota rather than the total number of studies. But there are a couple of trends that really stand out. So a lot of papers on indicators of soil fertility, I believe Kate mentioned that quite briefly as well. That's been a huge area of research, 40 papers, but a huge area of research for soil fauna as indicators of soil fertility. And there's also been quite a lot of research on knowledge comparison, so typically comparing whether scientific indicators of soil quality and fertility match with local indicators. Some other interesting areas: pest management, integrated pest management, and a number of studies of very detailed folk taxonomies, as I mentioned. And over here, I think this is probably one of, I won't do that, I'll just get lost. One of the most interesting elements is this direct manipulation of soil biota in agricultural management. So there are some really interesting examples of using termite soil as amendments to agricultural soil from across Africa and also in Southeast Asia as well. So some really fascinating topics as part of this overall use of soil fauna. Being a geographer, I would just feel it deeply in my genes to show you some maps of where some of these studies have been done, looking at the two most common categories of the two most common themes from these papers: soil macrofauna or soil biota as an indicator of soil fertility in purple, and some element of knowledge comparison or integration in yellow. You can see that there's quite a good deal of overlap there. Those two sorts of themes are quite often encompassed in one study. And this brings me back to one of the original points that I mentioned, which is the importance that's currently being attached to integrated knowledge or hybrid knowledge, and that's certainly shown up in the published research on soil biota knowledge by farmers. I also just wanted to come back to that Venn diagram of the three elements of ethno-ecological knowledge domains, so knowledge, practice and belief. And I haven't added up all the numbers in terms of trying to quantify which of these studies encompass which of these three domains, but I think it's quite fair to say that the majority of the papers focused on practice. That is a self-selection effect to some extent. There was some attention to knowledge and observations of soil fauna, but there were very few studies that integrated any kind of asking questions about beliefs or myths or rituals that involved invertebrates. There were some, and I know there are some people in this room who've authored papers on those. So. Okay, so the emphasis based on the review is on visible, harmful or useful taxa. I've already spoken about a couple of those first points, but really important to, I think, identify a couple of potential gaps in knowledge, which I'd like to discuss using a couple of very brief case studies. So the first question, obviously, is we don't have that much published information. So is this topic, is it actually not that important, or is it simply underreported? And I'd like to use a case study example from Honduras to illustrate that. And the second one, I really, really hope I'm wrong about that. I hope I have been looking in all the wrong places. So if I have, please let me know. We know that extension, including elements of soil biology, is actually occurring with farmers, but it does seem, from what I've looked for so far, that the results seem to be underrepresented. Okay, orange light. So the first case study, just wanted to look at from Honduras. This is where I did my PhD research. It's a very interesting agricultural system because it does represent an expression of hybrid knowledge over a number of years. The farmers in this area have moved from slash and burn cultivation to slash and mulch cultivation. And I spent several months walking around in the fields trying to understand the spatial patterns of distribution of soil macrofauna, digging lots of holes, not really getting very far, and eventually came to the realisation that probably the people who worked those soils would know a lot more about it than I did. So we did some semi-structured, open-ended interviews with a number of farmers. We asked them about their knowledge of different elements of soil fauna, just to tell us what species they thought were important, their role in the agricultural system, where they were found, anything at all about soil fauna. If you would like to know the details of this diagram, which illustrates conceptually some of those relationships, please have a look at our paper. But if you remember nothing else, that's just what I want to say. I didn't know what the farmers were going to tell me. I didn't know if it would be interesting information, comprehensive. Some of it was what we might call inaccurate. Others had very important and detailed information. But if you don't ask the questions, you won't know. So if you're working with farmers, ask them these questions and you might be very surprised by their answers. The second case study, this is very much Lynette Abbott's baby. She's been working with soil health and farmers for a very long time. Over the last couple of years, she's been giving a series of workshops with the Wheatbelt NRM, Natural Resource Management, South West Catchment Council and so on, in a number of locations throughout the southwest of Western Australia. Totally different farming system, broadacre farming system, very nutrient poor soils, and as a result mycorrhizal fungi can be very important in these soils. So she's been holding a number of workshops with farmers who come along, they're invited, they're interested in these topics, and they want to know more about how they can monitor soil biodiversity on their farms. The video is working, all right. So just as an example of some of the materials the farmers have access to in these workshops, they're given simple techniques for taking fixed volumes of soil using PVC pipes, very simple. A simple method for extracting soil mesofauna using a bottle, a light, some gauze. That's all. The soil mesofauna will fall out in the bottom. The mites and springtails are the most important things they're looking for. A little microscope, a portable low-cost microscope, is used to give some digital images of what those samples are looking like. And as I can see from everyone looking at the video, this is really interesting to most people. This is a sample from one of Lynn's compost. So the sorts of resources they have access to, some sheets that will detail various different elements, so mites and springtails and so on, how they can be identified. And Lynn has also been working on some farmer-friendly techniques to stain for mycorrhizal fungi. It's not as good an image as you will have in the lab, but Lynn does tell me that with some training, you can identify whether the fungi are present or not. If anyone has any questions about the next steps for this, I'd be happy to answer them, but I will go on to the key message. So our review shows that local knowledge of soil biodiversity and soil life exists, okay? The depth of knowledge is variable, but it is out there. It's worth looking for it. And the two conclusions I've come to, based on what I've read, okay, and I know that this is not, there have been some very interesting studies on this, but it does appear that farmers are really deliberately or deeply consulted about their knowledge of soil life, and integrated with other aspects of soil quality research with local farmers. And it does appear that research is rarely published on the understanding and uptake of novel practices designed to enhance soil biological fertility. So the challenge is, how can we really develop these effective integrated hybrid knowledge and extension programs if we're not involving people whom we're trying to reach from the very beginning? Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, I have one.
Yes.
You mentioned that farmer perception was mainly on visible organisms. Of course, microbes are
Yes.
not, but there are microbes such as rhizobia that produce nodules. Did you find some kind of perception about the importance, the effect?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's something that I've started looking for. As yet, I haven't found anything. I've found some references to farmers interested in microbial activity, soil fauna activity and so on, but nothing so far that mentions fungi, rhizobia, anything like that. But I'm going to keep looking, so yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me. Excuse me, there is a question, but it's too late.
Okay.
I was lucky that you saw me. Because there is someone else here that wanted the question. Thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. I was wondering whether you came across any information on whether the perception of producers has been shifting from a balance between, you know, I have this intuition that there used to be a balanced view of soil fauna or soil organisms in general being some beneficial and some plagues. And because of a lot of pesticide advertisement, the producers have been shifting towards it is all wrong. If you see anything moving in your soil, beware, because it will kill your crops. Have you seen these reported or the trend somewhere?
Yeah, it's difficult to say from this sort of analysis that we did, because we're looking at a range of different studies from different geographical locations, and I think those sorts of questions would be much easier to answer if you had multiple studies from similar locations over time. I haven't picked up that particular element in the studies that we have that have been published. It's not to say that it doesn't exist, it's just that it wasn't in the study sample, but I think it's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, just one question more.
It was here. I thought it was interesting that you found those studies from Europe, but
Yes.
in the range of countries that you have, actually there are countries where agriculture has been going on for centuries or millennia, and others that are pretty new, so North America and Australia. Do you see any differences in these two categories of countries?
The studies that were from Australia and from America did have some similarities, and typically what they were when the researchers had gone out and started asking farmers questions about soil quality, how they understood soil life, and that sort of thing. And those studies tended to have only a very small focus on soil biota. It was just, oh, well, we like soil fauna activity, and that was pretty much as far as it went, as far as the questioning went anyway. Some of the studies that were from other regions of the world, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia and so on, there was a much more detailed understanding of soil fauna expressed in the studies. Whether that is a question of the way the farmers were asked or not is difficult to say. Yeah.